Thank you for listening, and welcome Dr. Valerie Stone and Shannon Bell to this discussion. Wonderful to see you. And I just want to add that please do put questions and answers into, or questions or comments into the Q&A or the chat. We'll try to monitor both. Let me spend a minute to introduce my guests. Shannon Bell is the director of the National Cancer Institute and National Institutes of Health Workforce Planning and Development Program, and the co-chair of Promoting an Equitable and Inclusive NCI Community. And Valerie Stone is the vice chair of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and the director of Health Equity in the Department of Medicine, and a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. And I just want to thank you both for being here today. And I thought we'd start perhaps with just letting you give a few opening comments, having heard the discussion, talk about your own experience and maybe what your organizations are doing to promote a more inclusive, representative workforce in this. Maybe Shannon, would you like to begin? Thank you.
Sure, I would be happy to. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's really fantastic to be here. It's very exciting. And I was actually delighted to hear the presentation and felt like it was very well done and just fantastic information that folks are getting. So that was really interesting to hear. So yeah, I'm at the National Cancer Institute, where I lead the Workforce Development and Planning Office. Broadly, we have three functions. The first is human capital planning, which is really closely tied to the equity work, because it's really important to understand who our workforce is. We also oversee the employee engagement function, which of course is also very tied to the equity, because this is where we really learn about and are able to impact how diverse staff experience the organization on a day-to-day basis. And then finally, the last component is the workforce development component, which of course most closely aligns with the lecture today. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about how NCI develops our staff, and that is our staff that work within our four walls. So not the broader workforce out in the field, such as at academic institutions such as your own, but rather the individuals who actually normally I would say show up to work, but that's not always true these days, but work with and directly for the National Cancer Institute. We have a number of programs specifically developed, specifically focused on developing leaders, because we think that's incredibly pivotal to the culture and the organization. So sort of broadly, that includes a number of programs across supervisor training. So, we have found, as in many fields where there's a high need for technical expertise, that sometimes people get promoted because they're really good technically, but that may not always mean that they're entirely prepared to be a supervisor. So we really want to ensure that supervisors have the skills and tools to manage the workforce. And I loved what Dr. Bierer said about the proactive retention. We provide guidance on when and how to conduct stay interviews. So you're talking to people on an ongoing basis about what are their career goals. Well, how can we support you? What keeps you here? What would potentially make you consider leaving? And how can we retain you? Because really, I think diversity recruitment is important, but I would always double down on retention. Absolutely. We also offer leadership development programs to ensure that NCI's current and future leaders have the skills essential to lead from wherever they are in the organization. And I think we view leadership broadly and understand that people can lead from anywhere, but we also have programs that are specifically geared towards supervisors and managers. And all of our programs at all levels actually include tools and resources on both inclusion and bias, because we think that is critically important and a foundational issue. We also provide actually individual coaching, which I noticed you also mentioned. And we actually have a couple of iterations. Broadly, the goal of this is to improve effectiveness and working relationships. But we do that through executive coaching, which is sort of what I think people often think of as coaching, is you have a one-on-one engagement with a certified coach, and you see them on a regular basis for a period of time, and that we sort of build on their strengths and address any weaknesses we think, or they think really, that they may have, or things that are getting in their way. But we also do situational coaching. So if a particular problem is just overwhelming or they need some support, we do situational coaching. We do some group and peer coaching, and then we also do some facilitated coaching to help individuals who need to work together, but for whom that may not be coming very simply, or maybe things have gotten in the way, and we help them to figure out how to do that more effectively. We also have a number of programs focused on developing staff more generally, and these resources are all accessible to staff at all levels of the NCI. So while they are also available to leadership, they're available across the spectrum of staff. And this includes a number of individual development courses that we push out, from effective communication to your CQ bias, which is or CQ competency, which is a bias course, inside out coaching, which is teaching leaders and individual contributors how to coach in the moment, to sort of come from a coaching perspective than a knowing perspective. And then we also provide career development. So enhancing people's current performance where they are, helping them prepare and consider where their future opportunities may be, and providing workshops and resources around that. And then we have a formal mentoring program where we actually support folks in identifying mentors around a particular issue that they get to define. What would they most like mentoring around, and have developmental courses as a part of that. But we are also, excuse me, in the process of developing a mentoring hub to provide sort of resources and best practices for anybody at any role as they think about being a mentor, or selecting a mentor, or if I want to, what is the difference between mentoring and sponsorship, or all of these different sort of pieces you hear. It's really important to understand that and know those differences, and then know what doing it well looks like. So that as part of our equity work, we are just now starting to collect demographics on participants who access our services. And we are also really considering our processes and policies, and thinking about where are there systemic barriers to participation, so that we might be able to address those. And then finally, we also develop organizational or team capacity via our team and office services. So we consult with leaders to develop customized interventions, assessments, strategic planning, process improvements, sort of those kind of things. And that can take really any iteration based on what the organization comes to us with, or the individuals in the organization, and what their needs are. So this office has actually been a part of NCI, although in a number of different iterations, since 1999. But more recently, as you mentioned, I'm co-chairing a part of the Promoting an Inclusive and Equitable Internal NCI Community Group, and that is part of NCI's robust NCI Equity and Inclusion Program that was started in 2020, and really is focused more broadly on the cancer research environment and workforce that you sort of defined, more close to the way you defined it at the beginning of this presentation. So in addition to other components, the program has a work group that focuses on increasing and enhancing health disparities research, increasing diversity of thought across the science workforce. So again, defined broadly. And then the one I co-chair is really more narrowly focused and aligns really with the work of my office, and that is diversifying the workforce and creating inclusion and equity across the experience of those folks who work within the NCI.
Thank you.
This new program has actually initiated over 30 new activities in this first 2 years, which have included collecting and analyzing information, so we really understand what we're calling the current state of NCI. So what are the demographics, and then what are the experiences, and how do those experiences vary based on how someone sees themselves or others see them. And then also including in the extramural community that we fund. It's been a variety of things, from 2 RFIs around health disparities research, and diversification of the broad cancer research workforce, as well as actual couple of RFAs on connecting underrepresented populations to clinical trials. That one was worth a mention here. and to recruiting more diverse trainees, because we do know that, you know, you've got to have a pipeline in the place, and you really want to nurture that from a very young age. So again, a number of new activities that we are starting. And so that's sort of a broad overview of NCI, my office, and the equity program, really broad, but.
Thank you so much, and so much to dig into as we unpack the conversation. But let me pivot to Valerie and see, you know, I know that you've really remodeled how the Brigham and Women's Hospital generally and the Department of Medicine specifically have thought about workforce development and a commitment to diversity and inclusion broadly. And I wonder if you could think about how you discuss how you're thinking about it and approaching it.
Sure. Barbara, first of all, I'd like to thank you for your excellent talk. It really made a large number of critically important points, and obviously very compelling and concerning data that I think so many of us are committed to making the future look different than where we are right now and where we've been in the past. My position as Vice Chair for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion really grew out of the department's recognition that their long-term strategy of recruiting a diverse residency class so that they would have diverse faculty had over a long period of time not worked. And it probably was more to the strategy, but the bottom line was we'd had a diverse residency for a while, and we had a slightly diverse faculty group, but there was a lot of problems with retention and a lot of departures. So the goal of my position was to really ideally increase the recruitment of minority faculty, but also dramatically improve the retention with the goal of increasing the representation, and that representation both in terms of numbers and percents. But then, of course, the underlying goal was, in addition, to keep those faculty long enough that they would experience career advancement, academic promotion, and leadership opportunities and positions, and that we would do this through a series of different programs to get to those goals. At the same time, we realized that there had been little focus on our fellows. And importantly, we felt that making sure that our fellows were part of a supportive, our underrepresented minority fellows were part of a supportive community and felt part of the entire URIM community at the Brigham would make them more likely to stay as faculty, since very few people were going directly from residency to a faculty position. And so we understood that this was a group of trainees that we sort of had failed to focus on before. So we were focusing on all three levels, residency, fellows, and faculty, but with the largest goal being accruing more faculty with more senior positions who advanced in terms of their career and their career satisfaction over time. And so I guess I would say that I think there's a set of core components to this sort of work that I just would like to emphasize. And much of it Barbara has said already in her slide number 16, but I want to really highlight it. Many people talk about DEI, but they it's fluffy. There's not really a plan. There's not really a feeling of it, whether it really matters, whether they get anywhere or not. They're just kind of doing it. And I think the key is to think about this just like as I think about it as a physician, taking care of patients. I'm serious about this. I have a plan and I expect an outcome if everything goes well. Similarly with our research, similarly with our analyses. So I would like to have that same approach where we need a commitment to making a difference. And that commitment needs to just not be on the part of the people in charge of the DEI work, but it has to be on the part of the leadership. The leadership has to have a stated commitment that they say frequently in public, and of course, back that up with resources, both financial resources and leadership personnel to actually roll out and basically implement the DEI strategy. I think that first of all, there need to be a sense of what the outcomes are that one wants to achieve. So obviously I talked about our outcomes, increase in percent and numbers of URIM faculty. We also have some outcomes around them doing research and getting promoted and retention and so forth. But you have to have clear outcomes and then the ability to track those outcomes. The ability to track the outcomes means you have to have clear data on where you are. For example, the number of minority faculty, what their academic ranks are, how long they stay at those academic ranks, and how many are getting promoted per year, and really pretty detailed metrics. So, so the commitment to an analysis process where we look at the how we do in terms of these outcomes on a yearly and semi-yearly basis. Of course, there also need to be a set of clear strategies and tactics for positively affecting these outcomes, funding as well as resources and other terms to make these outcomes and programs possible. And I would say when it comes to the funding, there need to be funds for programs, funds for the personnel to carry out the programs, but I would also say a recognition that many underrepresented minority faculty may need a different compensation structure than others. Perhaps it's not salary, but if the average minority faculty member is coming in with a tremendously higher percentage, a higher amount of loans, so perhaps they have some loan forgiveness built in. Perhaps there's a signing bonus to help with the loan forgiveness. But the bottom line is there needs to be an understanding that our relatively low salaries in academic medicine may be more of a burden to people who have no generational wealth and come in relatively disadvantaged. I also think that there can be bonuses for the leadership, such as division chiefs, that are tied to working in the DEI space and also achieving certain metrics. And finally, it goes along with all of this to say there needs to be accountability by the overall leadership and any, leaders such as myself who are working in this domain for actually achieving the stated outcomes. And if they're unable to achieve those outcomes, to look strategically at the tactics that have been used and think about how they might need to be modified to be more effective going forward.
Great. So let me start with just picking up on your last point. When you think about accountability for this, what's the time course that we should be judging it on? Because I think that's complicated. I think it's got to be real. If annual, there, I just don't know how to think about that. If we really want to develop people, it's years, and we need to stay in it, and we need to commit to people. So how do you think about that?
Well, I think that you need to have some outcomes that are reasonable to track over an annual basis. So for example, as I said, our department was challenged by a lot of departures of minority faculty. So my first outcome I wanted to influence was increasing retention. And that is not the same as getting to associate professor. It's not. It basically is intervening on people who seem like there may be some challenges, doing some things to enhance their retention. For the big ones, try to create a retention package, but also to change the environment such that people say, hey, this is a pretty nice place to be. I'm enjoying how people are supporting me. I'm enjoying the community. I don't see that at maybe the other places I'm looking at. So that was an outcome we were able to, affect within a year and could really see a difference within a year. I also think that while one may not go from having 5% minority faculty to 10% in 1 year, you know, we can measure small increments in between, and going to 5.2% is much better than going in the wrong direction. So I think every step of the way, it makes sense to look at the data and see. And I mean, I don't want to suggest that we've been dramatically successful on every outcome every year. I mean, I feel a little hesitant to say this, but I'm going to say it as you know, sort of discreetly as I can. But the number of promotions of our minority faculty, my first full year at the Brigham, was shockingly disappointing. And but I have to say, you know, I didn't think that this was something I was going to affect in the first year, but it certainly made me say, well, whatever I was doing that first year sure didn't help, and we have to do something more. And in the second year, approximately 10 times as many minority faculty got promoted. So, you know, it really was impressive that once we started, you know, paying attention to it, it made a difference. And, you know, some of these things are supporting people's careers, you know, mentorship and sponsorship and helping them to get funding. Some of it is helping the process, because our process for promotion had the, you know, helping them with the process, because the process is so challenging and onerous and time consuming here at Harvard Medical School. So, you know, there's those two pieces, the actual outcomes that you have to do to get promoted, and then the process of getting promoted.
Right, right. And then supporting the process so people
Right.
can.
Yes, very important.
Yeah. So Shannon, let me turn this back to you. How, how do you create time for mentorship? How is it compensated? Is it rewarded? Is it supported? You know, you mentioned that there's a formal program, but people aren't evaluated on the formal programs or informal programs. So how does that get built in?
Yeah, I think it's a critical question. And I think at NCI, we have the good fortune of training the next generation of scientists is the language that is literally a part of the Cancer Act. That is how we came into being. So, you know, it is seen as a fundamental component of everyone's job. And I think that puts us in a better position than perhaps folks at other places. That being said, that does not mean that everybody who works at NCI sees it as in a similar light and spends the same amount of time or puts the same effort into it, or even defines it the same. And so I think one of the things that we don't do well and are actually working on is acknowledging, rewarding, and really looking at it as a core component of someone's performance as they go through. We are actually starting to look at how to do that as part of a couple of things. We are looking at how do we ensure that anyone who's in a position to mentor, either formally or informally, but more formally, has to and has gone to some sort of a formal program to learn how to do it well. And I think that's critical. It's insufficient because it doesn't get at the rewarding. And I think that's really important. But I think that is a good starting point. I was going to say something else, but I can't remember.
Are there repercussions to those who don't participate, or is it incentives to participate that's an expectation?
Well, I mean, I think right now we're in the process of building it. So I think that is a yet to be answered question. I think, frankly, I think you should start with the incentive, you know, incentivize it, create a clear expectation, but I think there has to be accountability. And we are also, our office is in the process of building data dashboards so that each large organization component can look at and say, here are the demographics, here are the results from our culture survey that happens annually in the federal government, and should include those things of, here's the percentage of leaders in our organization who completed mentor training. Here are the pieces who are, you know what I mean? One of the things that we have done that we're also doing is building in lab culture and leader metrics into the peer review process, into the lab review process, to make that you're not just now getting we're not just looking at your science and your publications and your, right, all of those very individual things, but we're looking at how you lead the environment as well.
And Valerie, the same question to you: is mentorship, you know, rewarded in some way? Is it compensated? Is there time and expectation? I mean, one of the things I'm concerned about, as we increase the diversity on recruitment sort of bodies or uh, um,
Search
committees,
Yeah.
it's a tax on the time for people. It's
Mhm.
just, so how do we address that? How do you think about it?
Well, I mean, with regard to mentorship, I think that we have a really robust culture of mentorship for faculty at the Brigham, particularly faculty who are doing research. And so my colleague, the vice chair for faculty development, Dr. Ellen Seeley, has data that shows that of our 1,400 faculty, only 42 say they don't have a mentor, but they want a mentor. And so together we've worked to get those individuals mentors over the past year. I think that to us, those of us leading the DEI space, we felt the more critical point was to make sure that our trainees had mentors who could help them with getting opportunities, including research opportunities and career development that they needed at that very important developmental stage. And in fact, we collected data 2 years ago that showed that our minority residents, thus assigned mentors, didn't always click. And it was a high percentage of the time that it didn't work out and they didn't do anything about it and then would end up not having mentors. So with the wonderful help of Jennifer Goldsmith and a new junior faculty leader that I have, Dr. Zainab Jaji, we developed an intentional program to match our minority incoming interns with mentors based on their stated interests and then their stated type of mentor they wanted, whether it was for career, for life work integration, or whether they wanted someone that was their same race and gender or race, and to sort of serve as a guide to the institution. And so we made these very intentional matches, made sure that the mentors were agreeable to it, that they said that they had the time. And then to ensure that these really worked out well, we facilitated the first meeting, but then in addition, we've had two mentoring across differences workshops to really assist the mentors in understanding how to negotiate any differences between them, which even though we provided the types of mentors people asked for, there were differences by sexual orientation, by gender, and even, the URIMs who got URIM mentors. Sometimes one was Black and one was Latinx, or one was Black and one was Indigenous. So I think that has really gotten people talking about how to be extremely effective when the mentee is an underrepresented minority and may have, specific types of challenges in the institution.
Great. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we also created mentorship communities led by two minority faculty and have 4 different ones with 4 different themes. And every minority resident was assigned to one of these mentorship communities. The goal was to give them a safe space to talk about a particular, sort of all the things going on with them, and also to build community, particularly in this time of COVID. I'm about to work to launch a similar thing for our women new faculty in the coming year, because we've gotten a lot of requests for that sort of thing. And it really makes a difference because it's sort of like it creates almost a co-mentorship model when you have this group that has these 2 senior people talking to a younger group of trainees or faculty about a wide range of topics.
Yeah, interesting. And let me ask, at the NCI, do you do anything intentionally for mentoring across differences? Do you have different programs or efforts or views in terms of how you approach minority individuals than the general group?
We have not. We have not done that at all. And that is not something that we have explored yet. Um, I think it's incredibly important. And I love the co-mentoring model. I think that's really fantastic. We find that as part of the mentoring program that we have a really broad range. We have a broad range of like levels from very entry level to relatively senior. We have a broad range of ethnic, race, gender, as well as science, administrative, sort of health infrastructure support. So what we found because of that sort of, you know, ongoing, we get a diverse group each time, which has just sort of been fortune, is that the amount of support that folks are finding within those groups is critical, but it's also a fairly large group. So you've got 35 to 40 people every time, which then allows people to sort of find their niche. But we have not explored, actually, we are talking about a model, but we're way early in the process for looking at new hires who come in and are from underrepresented groups, and if how, what we might be able to do in terms of either creating cohorts and or mentoring. So I think we're exploring that.
And do either of you have data on the most successful methods to hire underrepresented minority individuals? Does hiring cohorts, that concept, make a difference? Does it matter? Is there data that we should be saying from now on, this is what we should be doing?
So it seems like the first grant announcement, from the NIH cited a lot of data saying that was the case. Previous to reading the RFP, I wasn't aware of that data. And we were not successful at getting one here at Harvard Medical School, despite applying. So my view was, we have our own cohort here. So, I had worked with our division chiefs to hire a number of new faculty over the last year. And so we created a new and early career faculty group, and we do events for them, on things like how to get promoted, how to understand how our institution is organized, more information about grant opportunities and other things to help them connect and share information with each other that they may know because they find it out, or because one mentor has shared something with one of them and they can share it with each other. So my goal was to create a cohort, and I think it really has made a difference. And similar to the last concept I mentioned, I think doing something like this extremely intentionally during the time of COVID was very important. And I think it's really made a difference for some of these faculty who were recruited from out of, most of them from out of town with, big goals here, but knowing virtually no one except for their mentor. And so I think it has made a tremendous difference. And I think it makes them feel like they learn, they connect to people, they get more information, they feel a part of a network, and that makes them more likely to stay, and I hope more likely to succeed as well.
Yeah. And Shannon?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of research out there that indicates that cohorts really help that very initial stage of folks coming in, particularly if they're from underrepresented groups. I think we have done a lot of that and find it to be incredibly helpful. That is part of why, very much like Valerie was saying, we have sort of built in developmental and community pieces into our cohort programs, so that they're not just coming in a cohort, but they're learning together, they're doing together. And I think it does make a difference. I also will say it is in and of itself not sufficient, not surprisingly, right? So I think it's a great tool. I think it's absolutely one that should be maximized. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the vast majority of people who leave a job say they leave their supervisor. So it really is about who you are reporting to, whatever that looks like in your environment, and the relationship you have with them. That is probably the single most important thing. And so focusing on leadership knowledge, leadership behaviors is critically important as an another piece to building that initial cohort.
And I think that's particularly important in research. And frankly, when you're on the clinical, floors, you've got a much larger environment than when you're living in a lab and you're literally reporting to one person and they're setting the culture, they're setting the climate. Lots of issues there. So that's a very good point. Yeah. Um, and as we think about research, one of the things that I feel is that in order to increase the proportion of diverse participants in clinical trials and clinical research, it is helpful to have uh, investigators that look like or that are the same race ethnicity as the participants. But we can't really wait for that group to come along and be senior PIs. And therefore, it's very important to think about the research staff that are actually interacting with the patients or participants, and that we should be much more intentional about recruiting, training, retaining that group of people, which has not been a particular focus to date. I wonder if you want to comment on that, either of you.
Well, I would absolutely agree with you 100%. And I think it is really being intentional about how you're recruiting to increase your numbers. And we know that, professionals at all levels in these fields in particular are underrepresented. There are huge underrepresentation, so it is hard. And I think you absolutely have to do two things. I think you have to recruit the rest of the staff, the surrounding staff beyond that initial, that primary, to be as reflective of the community you're serving as possible. And I think you also have to make it an absolute priority to do cultural humility and have the folks who aren't necessarily of the community or representative of the communities you're serving to really understand that no matter how much they do, no matter how much they may learn, no matter how much exposure they may get, their lens is going to be different and limited, and to come from a place of inquiry and openness of how is this working? What does this mean to you? How do you want this to look? And I think that is really, I think if you do those two things, it's best case scenario in the absence of the other piece.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so much like clinical care that we have the front desk problem, which you described incredibly clearly. And then you have every staff person along the way that either the patient or the trial participant interacts with is going to have an impact on them. And sometimes they don't even know who the senior PI is. Hopefully they do, but it's all of the people that they interact with who either need to be culturally competent or need to, share some part of their culture or their identity. Most of my research has been in HIV/AIDS, in doing disparities in health equity research, some of it community participatory research. So this was something I did from the very beginning, and I think AIDS research actually prioritized this very highly at a time that other types of trials weren't. And I think, cancer trials have done a great job of following suit. And so I think it really is so important to think about reflecting the community that we want to recruit by recruiting that sort of staff. And luckily, I think it has not been that difficult to find, nurses and research assistants and other types of personnel of color who are very excited about being in these sorts of roles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. Um, I want to ask one sensitive question before the end, which is, have you done a salary equity review? And how that's a pretty complicated process because everybody's a little bit different. But in general, as the data shows, overall, even if you account for all the missingness and all the differences, there's an inequity. And how do you address that?
So in our department, before I arrived, for about 2 years before I arrived, they began doing a salary equity evaluation within every division. It is reported back to the division chief each year. And if there are any uh, people who are too high or too low from the standard, range for a given type of role, faculty rank, and years in the position, they have to explain why. In general, there's been a lot of corrections, and now there isn't that much variability. And this salary equity analysis is both by gender and by race ethnicity. Unfortunately, I would say the salaries are more equitable, but they're too low.
Yeah.
So that's that. I mean, we're glad they're equitable, but I think they're challenging for many people. And this is, I think the equity doesn't solve everything.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree. Shannon?
Yeah, we actually are just starting to do, we've just started in the last year to do pay equity when people onboard. So, government has its own special rules around, well, everything. Everything. But so we have to do it up front. And so now we are doing we're doing it with all our what are called Title 42 hires, which are not people in the GS scale, but tend to be more the medical professionals, MDs, PhDs, scientists. And we are starting it there because there's more latitude in what you can pay. Often in the GS scales, there's very limited latitude. And so that is the system itself is a systemic barrier, which we have not figured out how to address. But we are doing pay equity as we onboard staff. And we've actually hired a contractor to help us with that. And are looking at developing a standard process and figuring out if we have the capacity internally to do it broadly with every Title 42 hire, or if we don't, what would the economic burden be to have a contractor to do that analysis for us on an ongoing basis, because we think it's pivotal important. And ours also is gender and race.
Thank you. There's an interesting comment in the Q&A which says, are other institutions creating research RVUs to allow clinicians to obtain credit for research? So
No.
no.
I think we are trying to provide some funding for junior minority faculty who join us who may have a research interest but no funding at the outset. But no, there's not an ability to do the RVO concept. That would be incredibly expensive.
And if that's the case, then there should be sort of an RVU equivalent for mentoring and for all the other things people are asked to do. It's a really interesting concept. I can tell you that at least in our, refined ivory tower, we get to support in research. We get to also find our own salary support for doing research at all. It's not supported by the institution. So it's a double whammy. And for that, we thank the NCI for helping us to at least get on the path of doing research. Well, it's 6 o'clock. The time has flown. Thank you so much for spending the hours with us. And thank you for your leadership in this domain and for really making us think seriously about how, as Valerie says, to have a future that's different than it is today. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you.
And everyone have a wonderful evening.
You too.